The walls we build around our hearts often end up imprisoning us, not protecting us. On the day I decided to call it quits on my marriage, I suddenly realized I could hear what people were actually thinking. I had spent years assuming my wife, who treated me like a stranger, was counting down the days until we split. Instead, I heard her inner voice screaming in a panic, wondering what she would do now that her husband was leaving her. "I don't want a divorce," she sobbed internally, leaving me completely frozen. Before I could process it, I blinked and found myself standing on the Seattle University campus during my sophomore year. It was the exact moment I first confessed my feelings to Sarah, the campus sweetheart who was currently rejecting me in front of everyone. The crowd around us was snickering at my expense, but I could clearly hear the sheer joy radiating from her mind. She was thinking about how wonderful it was that I had finally asked her out. She was already planning to make me miserable just so I would be obsessed with her forever. Fuming with rage, I ripped my love letter into confetti and tossed it into the trash right in front of her face. Back in the present, I sat at our kitchen island in our Seattle apartment and told Sarah I wanted a divorce. She didn't even look up from the stove, coldly telling me to stop bothering her while she was making dinner. I gave a bitter laugh, knowing that in her eyes, my very existence was a nuisance. The silence only broke when I slid the divorce papers across the counter, causing her to freeze mid-motion. I told her to just sign the documents if everything looked okay to her. Her eyes were locked on the words "petition for divorce," and I noticed her hands were shaking as she held the pages. I figured she was probably thrilled to finally be rid of me. Between our 4 years at the University of Washington and 5 years of marriage, I had been like a shadow she couldn't shake off. She only agreed to marry me because I was relentless in my pursuit, even though her disdain for me seemed to be part of her DNA. Over the last 5 years, I finally learned the hard way that you can't force someone to love you. It was a brutal realization, but I was done trying to make a one-sided relationship work. I had to accept the reality that Sarah simply didn't care for me. No matter how much effort I put in, she was never going to love me back. It was time for me to wake up from this pathetic fantasy I had been living in. Sarah's mouth opened slightly, and I braced myself for her to agree to the split. Instead, the sound of someone sobbing filled my head. Her inner voice was wailing about how her husband was abandoning her and how she had no idea what to do. Did I do something to piss him off lately? She wondered through her internal tears. I don't think I did. So why is this happening? I stood there in total shock, realizing the voice belonged to the woman who usually treated me with nothing but icy silence. She had never used such an affectionate tone with me in real life. Since our wedding, every time I tried to get close, she would push me away with a look of pure revulsion. She used to scream at me to keep my distance, so there was no way she actually cared about how I felt. I told myself I was hallucinating or having some kind of mental breakdown. Then, her thoughts raced even faster, suggesting she should pretend to choke on her dinner. She thought that if I had to rush her to the ER, it would buy her some time to stop the divorce. But what happens after we get to the hospital? She panicked internally. Maybe I should just break my leg because I heard those take 3 months to heal. I was absolutely speechless as I listened to her consider self-harm just to keep me around. Sarah hadn't moved her lips, so I knew for a fact I was hearing her private thoughts. It was as if she had been replaced by a completely different person. I opened my mouth to say something, but the world suddenly faded into darkness. "If that's a love letter, don't bother. I'm not interested," a girl's voice said, sounding sweet but completely detached. I snapped my eyes open and looked around the familiar quad of my college. I was staggered to realize I was back in my sophomore year at the university. I was holding a crumpled envelope in my hand, while 19-year-old Sarah Sterling stood before me. She had her chin up, looking at me with pure condescension as if I were some pathetic loser. Her expression suggested I should have checked a mirror before thinking I was in her league. It hit me that this was the day I had finally gathered the nerve to ask her out after 2 years of pining. She frowned, wondering why I was just standing there silently. Then, her internal monologue cut through the air with startling clarity. "Oh my God, he's finally doing it," she thought gleefully. "I'm going to make him cry so hard. Come on, Morrison, just say you love me already. I'm waiting. I can't wait to see the look on his face when I shut him down in front of everyone. So why is he just standing there? A sudden realization sparked a flame of pure rage inside me. It seemed Sarah had actually liked me all along and had just been playing a twisted game for years. If that was true, then every ounce of effort and devotion I had given her was a complete joke. To her, I was probably just a clown she enjoyed watching. I ground my teeth together so hard my jaw ached, my knuckles turning white as I clenched my fists. Sarah noticed my reaction and tried to keep her cool, but I could hear her heart starting to race with anxiety. Something is wrong. He looks furious, she thought, her internal voice trembling. Maybe I should tell him I need to test his loyalty first to keep him interested. But what if he actually gives up on me? Oh no, what am I supposed to do? She gave a little pout, as if making a huge sacrifice, and reached out to take the letter. She told me she would accept the note, but made sure to add that it didn't mean she was saying yes. She claimed she needed time to evaluate whether I was worthy of her. Seeing her smug face while she pretended to be doing me a favor made my blood boil. I asked her who told her the letter was even meant for her. She looked stunned for a second, and before she could respond, I shredded the envelope into tiny bits. I told her to get out of the way because she was blocking the trash can. I brushed past her shoulder and dumped the scraps of paper into the bin right behind her. The entire courtyard went silent, and I heard Sarah gasp as her mind screamed, wondering why I would destroy a letter meant for her. I saw her eyes welling up with tears out of the corner of my vision, but I didn't care. I turned my back on her and walked away without a single word of explanation. Later, in the cafeteria, I sat staring at my tray in daze, trying to process the fact that I had traveled 8 years back in time. It was clear from Sarah's confusion that I was the only one who had retained my memories of the future. My roommate, David Hayes, interrupted my thoughts by shoving his phone in my face and telling me to check the campus Facebook page. Someone had snapped a photo of Sarah looking absolutely frantic. The contrast between her earlier arrogance and the sight of her digging through a trash can was almost pathetic. The comments section was losing its mind, with everyone theorizing about what could possibly drive the campus queen to such a desperate act. I ignored the comments and focused on a photo of her holding one of the torn pieces of my letter. I let out a cold smirk, wondering why she was only showing interest now that I had walked away. David was still staring at the screen, remarking that whatever she was looking for must be priceless. He pointed out that a girl as rich and beautiful as Sarah Sterling usually wouldn't be caught dead near a dumpster unless it was for something life-changing. I thought about the years I spent orbiting her, offering nothing but my sincere devotion, which turned out to be the most worthless currency imaginable. I gave a dry laugh and told David that once something hits the trash, it's just garbage, regardless of what it used to be. That's not true. A sharp female voice interrupted us. I felt a hand grip my wrist and looked up to find Sarah staring back at me with wide eyes. For a split second, she looked startled before she quickly pulled her hand away. Her mind was racing with anxiety about having touched me after digging through the trash, even though she had apparently washed her hands multiple times. I was baffled by her internal panic and coolly asked her what she wanted. Sarah stared at me with watery eyes and insisted that the letter wasn't garbage. When I asked her to clarify, she mumbled something under her breath. Then, she pulled out the letter, which had been haphazardly taped back together into a crumpled mess. She held it up like a trophy, telling me she had fixed it, and looked at me with desperate hope. I frowned, knowing I had shredded that paper so finely that reassembling it must have taken her hours of tedious work. I didn't let my guard down and told her the letter was actually meant for a dog, so I didn't understand her obsession with it. Sarah's face went stiff for a moment before she quietly muttered that she was perfectly fine being that dog. Her response left me completely speechless. Back at the dorm, David was hovering over me, dying to know what was going on between me and the campus goddess. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that I had humiliated her, yet she had spent her afternoon scavenging through trash to save my letter. David kept pestering me to tell him my secret for finally winning over Sarah Sterling. He looked like he'd just won the lottery, his eyes wide with excitement. When I didn't join in on his excitement, he actually reached out to check if I had a fever wondering why I wasn't celebrating. He couldn't understand why I was so miserable since I didn't have a fever. I swatted his hand away and told him I was fine. David was genuinely shocked because he knew better than anyone that I had been obsessed with Sarah since the first day of freshman year. My crush had started as a secret until David eventually caught on to how much I changed whenever she was around. To him, this situation was a dream come true. He saw it as a classic romantic success story where the guy finally gets the girl of his dreams. To me, however, it felt like a sick joke. I had wasted 9 years of my life being devoted to her with nothing to show for it. Finding out now that she had liked me the whole time just made the last decade feel like a pathetic comedy. I told him I was finished being her lapdog. David looked stunned because he knew how obsessed I had been with her. My sudden lack of interest was so out of character that he didn't even know how to react. Instead of pushing me for more details, he pulled out 2 passes for a club downtown. He mentioned a promotion for Saturday night that included some free drinks and suggested we go. I was skeptical, but he just threw an arm around my shoulder with a massive grin. He told me to stop worrying about the drama and promised that a few beers would make me forget everything. I finally laughed and took the voucher from him. I didn't have much else to do, so I agreed to head out with him that weekend. The moment we stepped into the club, the bass hit me like a physical wall. Neon lights strobed across the room as people crowded the dance floor, moving in sync with the heavy rhythm. The entire place smelled like expensive perfume and bad decisions. This was exactly the kind of scene Sarah used to love, always dressing in her most provocative outfits before heading out. Back then, I used to get so jealous that I would try to convince her to wear a sweater over her dress. She used to call me old-fashioned and stubborn while I worried myself sick. She would glare at me, calling me a prude, and then storm off to bed in a huff. One night, I decided to give her a taste of her own medicine by heading out to a club with my friends. I wanted her to feel the same anxiety I felt every time she went out without me. I didn't even make it to the club before she intercepted me on the street, fuming with rage. She blocked my path and threatened to file for divorce if I took another step toward the bar. I was stunned by the sheer hypocrisy of her behavior. Thinking about those old memories made my blood pressure spike all over again. I slammed my glass down on the bar and felt a slight wave of dizziness from the alcohol. Suddenly, a soft, flirtatious voice whispered in my ear, asking if I was nursing a broken heart. I turned to see a girl who had made herself comfortable on the stool next to mine. She told me to forget whoever was bothering me, insisting that someone as attractive as me deserved better. She gave me a sugary smile that was clearly meant to be a provocation. Her glossy lips shimmered in the club lights as she continued to flirt. David kept nudging my arm, whispering that she was a major upgrade from the Ice Queen, Sarah Sterling. He was clearly enjoying the show and encouraging me to move on. David told me that if things didn't work out with one tree, I should just find a whole new forest to explore. I was about to tell him to shut up when I spotted a familiar figure approaching. Sarah was marching toward us with a look on her face that could have frozen the entire room. I froze as the sight of her immediately sobered me up. The air felt like it dropped 20 degrees the second she stopped in front of our table. She gave the girl sitting next to me a look so lethal that the poor girl practically vanished in a thin air. I almost called out to the girl to tell her she'd forgotten her drink, but she was long gone. Sarah remarked on how much fun I seemed to be having with a cold, terrifying smile. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was the eerie stillness that precedes a hurricane. She gripped the edge of her skirt and asked if I wanted her to bring the girl back so I could keep staring. Her voice was trembling with suppressed rage as she offered to chase the girl down for me. I told her not to bother because it wasn't that serious. I had never seen her this furious before, and I felt a wave of awkwardness wash over me. Suddenly, David let out a loud, fake groan and claimed he was too wasted to function. He dropped his head onto the table, pretending to be passed out to avoid the crossfire. I rolled my eyes at his bad acting. Sarah informed him that she had already called his sister to come pick him up and that she was waiting outside. Hearing that, David miraculously recovered and sprinted toward the exit without looking back. I couldn't believe what was happening. Before I could process David's departure, Sarah grabbed my ear and started pulling me toward the door. I yelped in pain as she dragged me out of the club, struggling to break free from her grip. I demanded that she let me go, but she turned around and silenced me by biting my lip. She told me to stay still, leaving me completely paralyzed in shock. I could still smell the faint, floral scent of her perfume as she stood inches from my face. She hauled me through the dense crowd and out into the cool night air. Watching her small figure lead the way gave me a strange sense of déjà vu. It was a sharp contrast to the woman in my memories who would always walk away from me without a second glance. By the time I came to my senses, she was shoving me into the passenger seat of her car. She stood in the doorframe, glaring at me with those expressive eyes. When she leaned in close, I flinched back automatically, trying to put some distance between us. My defensive reaction clearly stung her pride. She pointed out that I seemed to have changed, reminding me that I used to promise her I wouldn't drink. Now, she noted bitterly, I was not only drinking, but also flirting with random girls at a club. My heart skipped a beat as a wild thought occurred to me. Could this version of Sarah also have come back from the future? I kept my voice cold and asked her who she thought she was to dictate my life. I told her that my choices and my conversations were none of her business. Her face flushed a deep red as she screamed that I simply wasn't allowed to talk to other people. I was completely over her dramatics and tried to get out of the car. Before I could move, she slammed on the gas, and the car lurched forward into the Seattle night. There was no way I could wrestle the wheel away from her, and jumping out a moving car wasn't an option. I was trapped in the passenger seat with nowhere to go. I decided to just sit back and see exactly what kind of game she was playing. She drove us to the old apartment building where we had stayed during our first year together. The moment we stepped inside, she threw herself into my arms before I could even reach for the light switch. She asked me in a quiet, desperate voice if I had truly stopped loving her. The moonlight through the window cast long shadows across her face, making her look incredibly fragile. I found the whole situation ironic, since she was the one who had treated me like dirt for years. I took a deep breath and let out a cold, sharp laugh at the absurdity of it all. I told her flatly that she was right and that my feelings for her were dead. She gripped my wrist tighter and demanded to know if I was interested in the girl from the club. I looked her dead in the eye and told her I liked any girl with a good body, not just that one. She suddenly surged upward and pressed her lips against mine with a desperate intensity. I shoved her back, leaving her looking utterly defeated and on the verge of a breakdown. Her eyes were swimming with tears that looked like they were about to spill over at any second. She insisted I was lying, but I refused to even look at her. I told her that her little games and emotional outbursts wouldn't work on me anymore. I gave a weary sigh and told her that I was done being manipulated by her tears. My words seemed to break her, and she started sobbing uncontrollably. The more I ignored her, the louder her crying became. She reached out and tugged on my sleeve, looking up at me with the eyes of someone who was completely lost. She begged me to scold her or do anything as long as I didn't shut her out. I couldn't help but think about how I had spent years catering to her every whim while she treated my devotion like a punchline. She had taken everything I had to give and offered nothing but coldness in return. It was pathetic how the roles had reversed now that I was finally done with her. She looked devastated by my silence and leaned into me, almost as if she were trying to merge into my shadow. I didn't move an inch to comfort her. She whispered my name and pleaded with me to say something, anything. She took my hand and pressed it against her cheek, but I felt nothing but irritation. I pulled my hand away as if her touch were poisonous, not wanting to be near her for a second longer. I looked at her with a frozen expression and told her that some things can't be fixed. I compared our relationship to the letter she had shredded, telling her that no amount of tape could make it whole again. Once something is destroyed that thoroughly, it stays broken. I told her that love offered too late was as worthless as weeds in a garden. To my surprise, she pulled out a brand new, untouched envelope from her pocket. She handed it to me with shaking hands, telling me she had written a fresh one that wasn't torn. I was so livid that I actually felt like laughing at the absurdity of it. I asked her if she thought my life revolved entirely around her, and if she was just upset because she lost her favorite toy. It seemed she only cared now because she didn't have someone constantly groveling at her feet. I demanded to know what she thought I was. Panicked, she tried to explain herself, but I cut her off immediately. I told her that her constant rejections were just a way to keep me on a leash while she enjoyed the attention. I asked her if she was some kind of sadist who enjoyed watching me suffer through every rejection. She stood there, paralyzed, as I watched the realization of her own cruelty dawn on her face. My smile grew colder as I realized I had finally seen through her facade. Sarah looked even more heartbroken as she whispered a question that made me freeze. She asked if liking someone wasn't supposed to involve sadness and pain. I was completely baffled, having no idea what kind of twisted logic she was using to justify her behavior. She saw my confusion and bit her lip, choosing not to explain any further. Instead, she flipped on the living room lights and led me into the study. She told me to wait while she climbed onto a stool to reach a heavy photo album hidden on the top shelf of the bookcase. She blew the dust off the cover and opened a book of memories that had clearly been hidden for a long time. When you love someone, you want to know their history, but in nearly a decade, Sarah had never breathed a word about her family. It was a part of her life that had always been strictly off limits. Despite being married, I had never once met her parents or even seen a photo of them. Every time I tried to bring them up, she would shut down completely. Eventually, I just stopped asking, assuming it was a topic that would always remain a mystery. Now, it felt like the secrets she had guarded so closely were finally coming to light. She pointed to a woman in a faded photograph taken at a park, holding a toddler version of Sarah in her lap. "This was my mom," she whispered. The woman in the photos was stunning, possessing a grace that Sarah had clearly inherited. In the early pictures, her smile was radiant and her eyes were full of life. However, as I flipped through the album, her expression grew increasingly hollow and the light in her eyes seemed to vanish. Sarah pointed to a jagged hole in a group photo and told me that her father used to be there. It looked like a typical family portrait, but his image had been violently removed with scissors. The edges were rough and uneven, as if the person cutting it had been in a state of emotional distress. Most of the photos in the album had been mutilated in a similar way, some even showing scorch marks from fire. It was a disturbing sight that made my chest feel tight. Sarah explained that while her mother had been obsessed with her father, he had done nothing but break her heart. Sarah was just a toddler back then, barely able to form sentences, but she could feel her mother's crushing sadness. She remembered asking her mom why she was always crying. Instead of an answer, her mother would just pull her close and sob even more violently. Her mother would tell her it was because she loved her father too much. She taught Sarah that love was synonymous with pain and that tears were just part of the price you paid for caring. In the end, all the tears in the world weren't enough to make him stay. They eventually split up and moved on to start entirely new families, leaving Sarah behind like a forgotten relic of a failed experiment. They provided for her financially, but they completely withdrew any form of emotional support or affection. She had started her life as a cherished little princess, but that world had vanished overnight. Like so many people, she was still trying to survive the trauma of her upbringing. On the surface, she appeared independent and comfortable being alone, but it was all a defensive shell. Deep down, she was starving for affection, but she was convinced she wasn't worthy of it. This led her to constantly test the people around her, pushing them away just to see if they would fight to stay. It was a self-sabotaging cycle of trying to find security in rejection. She would push away anyone who got too close, finding a twisted sense of safety in being alone before they could leave her first. She reminded me of how I'd once told her I loved her from the moment we met at orientation. She looked at me then, her gaze flickering with a mix of shame and longing. She whispered that she had actually fallen for me at that exact same moment. She then moved a section of the bookshelf, revealing a hidden compartment that left me completely breathless. It was a massive wall covered in photos arranged in the shape of a butterfly. As I stepped closer, I realized with a shock that I was the subject of every single picture. It was a mosaic of my life over the last 9 years. She pointed to the photo at the top of the butterfly, explaining she had snapped it secretly the day we met. Suddenly, a flood of memories from that freshman orientation at Seattle University came rushing back to me. I remembered that day clearly because I was struggling with about 8 different bags and 2 massive suitcases. I was wobbling across the campus, looking like a total mess. The truth was that most of that luggage belonged to David, who had conveniently disappeared. He had claimed it was an emergency and ditched me with all his stuff while he ran for the restroom. I stood there looking at the mountain of bags, wondering if he was moving into a dorm or starting a small country. Even now, I still can't believe I let him talk me into holding all that gear. Sarah told me she had been watching me from across the quad and thought I was incredible. She saw a guy who was patient, kind, and willing to go through hell just to help a friend. She was struck by the fact that I didn't complain once, despite the ridiculous situation. She had a soft smile on her face as she reminisced, while I was busy imagining all the ways I was going to make David pay for that day. She then mentioned that she had actually approached me to offer help, which was news to me. I was caught off guard and asked her what had happened next. I had absolutely no memory of her being there. It turned out she had been observing me long before I ever worked up the courage to look her way. She explained that I was so buried under bags that I didn't even see her standing there. One of my heavy suitcases had rolled right on her foot. Instead of moving it away, I had apparently shoved it forward with all my might, crushing her toes in the process. I was mortified as the memory slowly resurfaced. I remembered thinking the suitcase was caught on a pebble and giving it a hard shove to get it moving. I had no idea that the pebble was actually the foot of the girl I would eventually marry. It turned out I'd basically run over her foot with a 60-pound bag. I apologized profusely, feeling like a total idiot for my lack of awareness. She just moved on to the next photo, which showed me standing by myself holding 3 different ice cream cones. She admitted that she had initially thought I was bringing treats to my friends. She had followed me for a while, only to realize I planned on eating all 3 of them by myself. She looked almost envious as she recalled how much of an appetite I had back in those days. I put my head in my hands, feeling absolutely roasted. While most girls were attracted to a guy's charm or confidence, she was apparently fascinated by my ability to inhale dairy. I had to stop her before she could point out any more of my embarrassing habits. I begged her to stop before I died of embarrassment from all the cringe-worthy memories. It felt like she had a curated gallery of my most awkward moments. Then, she dropped a bombshell, claiming that she was actually the one who confessed first. My brain went into a total tailspin. I had absolutely no memory of her ever confessing her feelings to me. Sarah pulled out her phone and navigated to an old post she had made the day before I gave her my letter. The caption simply read, "Under the same sky." I asked her what that was supposed to mean, and she explained that she had taken it outside the science building right when my class let out. She thought that because we were looking at the same clouds, it was a profound romantic gesture. She looked at me expectantly, genuinely believing that sharing a sky was a clear declaration of love. I stood there, stunned by her logic. I told her that unless I were a psychic or a detective, there was no way I could have interpreted that as anything other than a weather update. I asked her who could possibly understand such an obscure message. She countered by saying that I had liked the post on Facebook, so she assumed we were on the same page. I was completely at a loss for words, realized that our entire history was based on a massive communication breakdown. Sarah took a deep breath and began to explain her side of the story with newfound patience. She claimed to know everything about me, from my likes to my deepest habits. When I asked for an example, she pointed out that I smiled when I was happy and looked down when I was sad. She continued by saying I liked to eat when I was hungry and drink when I was thirsty. I stared at her for a moment before asking if she could provide an example that didn't apply to every living creature on Earth. She blushed and started listing more specific details that were actually relevant. She started naming my favorite meals and the specific way I like my coffee. I remembered how she used to claim she was only cooking for herself, yet every meal she served was something I loved. Back then, I just thought it was a lucky coincidence that our tastes aligned so perfectly. I asked her why she never just told me how she felt. It was frustrating to realize she had been studying me while keeping herself completely guarded. I had spent nearly a decade trying to get close to her, but she had built a wall so high I never even found the door. I had spent years convinced she either hated me or was in love with someone else. Sarah looked down at her feet and admitted she was terrified of showing me her real self. She was convinced that if I saw her flaws, I would eventually stop loving her. She was certain that true intimacy would lead to my disappointment and eventual departure. She had a deep-seated fear that she was fundamentally broken and that I would leave her just like everyone else had. In her mind, being abandoned was always her fault for not being perfect. She believed that if she had been smarter or more talented, her parents might have actually wanted to stay. She had spent her life trying to earn their love by being exceptional, hoping they would finally notice her. I couldn't let her keep thinking that way and interrupted her immediately. I told her that her parents' failures were their own and had absolutely nothing to do with her worth. I insisted she had done nothing wrong and didn't need to perform for anyone's affection. As I spoke, her eyes filled with tears that finally began to spill over. She told me that meeting me was like a dying tree finally finding water. She admitted that after experiencing the warmth I gave her, she couldn't stand the thought of going back to her lonely, dark existence. I took her face in my hands and looked her straight in the eyes. I explained that true love means accepting every part of a person, including the broken bits. It's not just about being attracted to the highlights. It's about being there for the moments of vulnerability, too. Anything less isn't love. It's just a temporary infatuation. Sarah gave me a sad, bittersweet smile and apologized for taking so long to understand how relationships worked. She admitted she hadn't realized that loving someone meant sharing their pain as well as their joy. She felt terrible for all the years she had let me suffer in silence. She told me she never wanted me to feel a single moment of sadness because of her. She ran her fingers over the intricate strings of the butterfly wall, which she had painstakingly woven by hand. It was clear that the display was her way of trying to hold onto the only person who ever truly cared for her. She admitted she wanted me to stay forever, but she feared that her own baggage would eventually drag me down. She had been prepared to let me go just to save me from the darkness she carried inside. She was willing to destroy her own happiness if it meant I could be happy somewhere else. I realized that while it seemed like she was trying to control me, she was actually the one trapped in her own fears. She told me about a wish she had made on a shooting star just before I brought up the divorce. She had asked for a chance to make things right, even if she didn't know how. She had noticed that the spark in my eyes had gone out and finally realized how much her behavior was hurting me. She felt like she was the only one failing in the relationship and desperately wanted to do over. Her wish was simply to go back to the beginning so she could try to be better. She wanted to give me the chance to choose a different path, even if it meant I wouldn't choose her. She looked at me with an intensity one had never seen before and whispered my name. Her affection for me was finally plain to see, no longer hidden behind a mask of indifference. She asked me if I could still love her now that I knew all her secrets and flaws. I was completely overwhelmed because my love for her had never truly died, no matter how hard I tried to kill it. I couldn't deny the connection we still had, despite everything. A decade of history isn't something you can just walk away from without a second thought. However, I couldn't just ignore the years of pain and neglect she had put me through. The scars from our marriage were just as real as the love she was now offering. I felt torn between my heart and my head, so I told her honestly that I didn't have an answer yet. I couldn't give her a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. She didn't seem surprised by my hesitation, almost as if she had expected me to say no. She gave me a soft, understanding smile and told me to take all the time I needed. She believed that time would eventually reveal what was meant to be for both of us. For the first time in 9 years, there were no more secrets between us, and we could finally see each other for who we really were. Our relationship changed as Sarah stopped acting like she was walking on eggshells. She began expressing her feelings and needs openly instead of hiding behind a wall of silence. She even started sharing the small, happy moments of her day with me through iMessage. She also became surprisingly affectionate and learned how to lean on me for support. One afternoon at the campus track, she tripped and fell while jogging with her friends. She told them she was fine, but the moment she saw me approaching, her entire demeanor changed. She started whining about how much it hurt and playfully asked if I would help her up. I couldn't help but laugh at her dramatic change in personality. I also noticed that she started buying sweets and milk tea whenever we went out together, which was a huge shift from her old habits. She would insist on us having a drink each, which brought back memories of our very first date. I had been so excited to buy her a sweet taro milk tea, thinking it was a safe bet for any girl. I had been so eager to please her back then. I had waited in line for ages to get the newest flavor, hoping she would love it as much as I did. Instead, she had scowled through the entire drink and told me to never buy it for her again. She had been so harsh that I felt like I'd committed a crime just by being thoughtful. I had been so confused by her reaction, wondering if it was the drink or just me that she hated. I eventually convinced myself she was just watching her figure and avoiding sugar. Now, years later, she finally told me the real reason behind that day. She admitted the drink was way too sweet for her because she hadn't had sugar in years. As a kid, she had developed terrible cavities from eating too much candy. She remembered one specific night when the pain was so intense she couldn't even open her mouth. Her parents had already checked out by then, leaving her alone in a massive house with only a part-time nanny. When the pain became unbearable after the nanny had left for the night, she had been forced to call 911 for herself. She was just a little girl, terrified and alone in a hospital. That trauma had stayed with her, making her fear sweets for most of her life. She tried to explain it all to me now, her hands moving nervously as she spoke. She admitted she had seen how hurt I was on that first date and realized too late that her bluntness had ruined the moment. She kept insisting she hadn't meant to be mean and that I had just misinterpreted her. I found her frantic explanation so endearing that I couldn't help but chuckle. My laughter only made her more anxious to prove herself, so I finally told her I believed her just to calm her down. Spending time with her in this new reality made me realize that her coldness was never intentional. She simply lacked the ability to translate her thoughts into kind words. What started as a warm thought in her head often came out as a sharp comment, which was as hilarious as it was frustrating. She confessed that she had actually ordered the exact same milk tea later that night, just to try and understand me. Slowly, she began to realize that enjoying a treat wouldn't automatically lead to a medical emergency. She finally started to associate sweetness with happiness instead of pain. She began to pay attention to the things I liked, try to learn the emotional skills she had never been taught. It was like watching a child learn to walk, as she navigated the world of affection by following my lead. It had taken 9 years, but I was finally teaching her what it meant to love and be loved. I showed her through my own actions that everyone deserves a chance at happiness. I taught her that you have to love yourself before you can truly accept love from someone else. She took those lessons to heart, and the rest of our time at Seattle University was surprisingly peaceful. We focused on our studies, but always made time for each other in the evenings. We spent hours walking around the campus track, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. We talked about our childhoods and made plans for a future that finally felt bright. On our graduation day, she beat me to the punch by taking the stage and confessing her love in front of the entire class. The crowd erupted into cheers as she stood there, looking more confident than ever. She was holding a bouquet of sunflowers, a perfect symbol of the loyalty and strength she had finally found. Her eyes were fixed on mine, radiating a warmth that I had once only dreamed of. She whispered my name and asked me one more time if I still loved her. I looked at her and felt a smile spread across my face, more genuine than anything I'd felt in years. I finally gave her the yes she had been waiting for. Right as I said it, the clouds broke and the Seattle sun flooded the quad with brilliant light. The sunflowers in her hand seemed to glow, mirroring the newfound radiance in her own expression. From that moment on, we stepped forward into a future that belonged to both of us. And when you finally accept that love is not a prize to be earned, but a gift to be shared, the silence between hearts becomes the sweetest conversation of all.